Hi, I'm John Atack, and I'm delighted to welcome Rachel Ann Dine.
Hi,
Hello, Rachel.
John. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Great pleasure. So if you'd like to do your introduction now.
You got it. Well, I'm Rachel Ann Dine. As you said, I'm a licensed professional counselor in several different states in the United States and have been in the mental health field since about 2005 and worked in a variety of different mental health settings, from long-term residential psychiatric inpatient facilities to acute psychiatric hospitals. I currently own and operate my mental health private practice and have a specialty in anxiety management, although I also specialize in what is now kind of considered the cult of one, or domestic violence
Hmm.
relationships or abusive relationships and recovery from such.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested in the topics that we're going to cover today and just look forward to sharing with you and hearing from you.
Hmm. Great. Well, it's very impressive credentials, I must say.
Well,
Um,
thank you.
so where would you like to begin on this particular journey?
So, John, for those of you that are not aware of all of the work that you have done and just your involvement in cultic groups and high demand groups,
Hmm.
would you mind sharing what ignited your interest in these particular topics and predatorial groups?
Well, at the age of 19, I was lured into the Scientology group, and I had 9 years. I was never a living member, so unlike most people, I wasn't humiliated and abused. At the
Hmm.
end of 9 years, I left. I left because I believed in Scientology, and I thought that Ron Hubbard had died. And I was at the center of an independent Scientology movement in the United Kingdom. And after about 6 months, I completely lost faith. And I found myself, it was a very strange situation because I found myself defending the independent Scientologists from the terrible harassment of the mother cult, but not believing myself anymore. And I wrote a book about in fact, the only history of Scientology. I think it might be the only history of any post Second World War
Hmm.
group, which is called Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky. I worked with the renowned biographer Russell Miller. I was his researcher for his excellent book, Barefaced Messiah, about Hubbard. And I've published, I don't know, about 500 articles and papers over the years. I've put out 300 videos. I've spoken at many conferences. My interests through the 1990s shifted from just Scientology. By then, I wanted to understand what the psychology was.
Hmm.
And so, in the 80s, I became close friends with Steve Hassan. We remained close friends. I met Margaret Singer, Jolly West, many of the significant figures at that time, and made a study of social psychology from the outside, looked at
Hmm.
tens of different groups, and gradually constructed my own hypothesis about authoritarianism, which to me is the central topic, and
Hmm.
began to talk about human predators. I've written a number of books. The last book was Opening Our Minds, which seeks to show that there's a spectrum from one-on-one abuse in personal intimate relationships right through to nations, North Korea, and of
Yes.
course what Putin is doing at the moment as well,
Mhm.
where authoritarianism is occurring, which is to say that you have somebody who thinks they should be in charge and they bully other people, and you have people who, for whatever reason, submit to that subjugation. Um, and my quest in life is to make that more comprehensible to people so that they won't be lured into such relationships themselves. They'll recognize human predators and hopefully not seek to witch hunt such people, seek to help them, but protect society, especially from the worst such people who somehow seem to find political office very easily.
Yes, they do. They do. And it sometimes doesn't I mean, it still does surprise me, but sometimes it doesn't because I have certainly noticed such an intense pattern of narcissism and that ability to inflate one's understanding and skills. And so I must ask you, what have you noticed in terms of how predators get into positions of power?
Well, I mean that Ruth Ben-Ghiat's book Strongmen is an excellent text on political predators, and quite very frightening in places, seeing just how destructive and abusive these people are on a
Mhm,
daily basis. What seems to happen particularly is that I see is that there is uncertainty, that
mhm.
in times when we're waiting for disaster, we're in the midst of disaster, when somebody comes along and says, I know the answer,
Yes.
then we tend to follow. It's surprising looking at Hitler that 45% of doctors in Germany joined the Nazi party.
Mm,
And it didn't matter that they'd spent however many years studying in university. They followed his certainty. If you look at
mm,
his arguments are ridiculous. They're ludicrous. They make no sense at all. But people fell in behind him. And we see that all over the world. We now have a plague of
mhm,
authoritarian leaders. Putin, Xi, Duterte, Bolsonaro, on and on and on. These people, the Hungarians have just returned their illiberal president. That's what he calls himself. He says
mm.
as an illiberal democracy. Um, and I think there's a factor of charm that such people can appear to be very charming.
Yes.
Um, they know how to flatter people. And,
Mhm, mhm.
we are all of us a little bit susceptible to that, I fear.
Absolutely. Mhm,
And we justify their meanness. We sort of, say, well, they were pushed to that. That was necessary because. I mean,
mhm.
hearing some of the accounts that are coming out of the Ukraine at the moment, where Ukrainians in areas where the Russians have already retreated, where Russian soldiers have told them that they are Nazis and that they've come to purge the Ukraine of Nazism. And sort of saying, you do realize that Zelensky is a Jew, don't you? The
Mm,
man you're accusing of heading. And it can become that irrational that people, they identify with a cause, they identify with a nation, they identify with a set of political or religious ideas, and they become fervent about that. And
mhm.
getting them to sit down, put their emotions aside, and think is extremely difficult, because their whole identity is caught up in being a Trump supporter, or belonging to Russia, or North Korea, or what have you. And getting people to reason is not an easy prospect, as I'm sure you have professionally found. On
Certainly. Yes. And it's always fascinating to me how, on such a small scale, relationships where there is abuse present, it lends its hand to being so similar to full scale groups where abuse is occurring. And so I noticed that you are definitely studying and have been immersed in, and in your book, if I'm not mistaken, Opening Our Minds also begins to talk about and cover and go in depth intimate relationships.
Yeah.
And so, what are your thoughts on? Well, I guess I have many questions, to pick your brain, but your thoughts on the manipulative tactics that are sometimes used towards susceptible people,
Mm.
or just not even just people in general, susceptibility there or not. I guess we all are susceptible to a certain level.
I think we all are, and I think it's a typical mistaken belief to think that people who are attracted into these relationships are unintelligent or weak.
Yes.
That vulnerability is often a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Hmm.
And I think that in my understanding, we all develop incredibly complex habits and routines in our lives. And as
Hmm.
soon as we are moved away from those routines, we become susceptible. Now, that could be a bad relationship breakup, but
Hmm.
it can also, I mean, commonly people are recruited into authoritarian cults either in their first term at college, when emotionally teenagers are more likely to be infatuated, or after retirement, as they are older. Those are the periods of emotional vulnerability. But I think any transition in life, moving to another town, getting into another, we want to belong, we want to be part of a group.
Yes.
That opens us up. So it is in fact our very sociability that makes us vulnerable. And you can decide to close the door and not have anything to do with anybody, and sort of develop what's called a schizoid personality. Or you are going to engage with people, and it's then looking at the first thing that I think is really relevant to understand is if anybody comes to you and they're tremendously friendly in their approach, they might just be a very friendly person. A very friendly person, but I think we should be suspicious of anybody who comes along and is seeking to be our new best friend, because they are probably going to try and sell us something.
Excellent point.
Yeah.
Yes.
Whether it's a product or a belief system, and the first way in will be flattery. And it's an interesting word. It means insincere praise. And so somebody who's coming along and telling us how wonderful we look, or how
your skills are above all,
about how competent, it's a softening up process. It's a getting you ready to then reach in and pull you along. Often recruiters for groups are selected because they have their manner and their appearance. And I mean, Steve Hassan says that he couldn't help but go to the Moonies 3-day event because these pretty girls were asking him to go,
and that's interesting. I have someone who I'm very close to, and they mentioned to me that they had visited a religious organization, and this gentleman specifically said all the women were beautiful, but they were just so doting and flattering, and this person just picked up on that right away and said something is not right. I mean, I don't want to doubt myself, but I know that this didn't feel genuine. And so that just speaks to the point that you're making. The flattery, the love bombing, it's such a necessary ingredient.
And indeed, the term love bombing was invented by the Moonies and has passed
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So it's a determined method. I mean, a lot of my work has been spotting the similarities. So in the 90s, I started studying terrorism before 9/11 and looking at historic terrorist groups and contemporary groups and saying, well, they run along the same lines. There's the same tricks are being used here. And when I finally saw a copy of the Al-Qaeda recruitment manual, it was shockingly close to the manuals that are used in the Moonies and in Scientology to get people.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Well, just to go back to something you shared about vulnerable times in a person's life and the age of college years. Yeah. I just so happened to read an article where a gentleman was tried and found guilty for running a cult at Sarah Lawrence College. I don't know if you were familiar with that, but he was the father of one of the students and moved himself into his daughter's dorm room. And from there created a high control group where there was sleep deprivation, behavioral control. And eventually it lended its hand to being a bit of a sex cult. And it was so damaging. And so anyways, he was found guilty, but even in the courtroom, he had multiple episodes of medical issues, otherwise very healthy gentleman. But I just thought it was so manipulative up until the very end, until being found guilty.
Well, I mean, watching Oscar Pistorius in the courtroom, when he was up for sentencing and he took off his leg extensions so you could see the stumps of his legs, and he whined at the court. And to some extent, I think he was only given a 7-year sentence for what he'd done. He did get off lightly and shouldn't have done. But again, that's something else with malignant narcissists and
Mm.
that type of human predator, that they will become self-pitying at the slightest push, and they'll
Mm.
go from having incredible bravado and self-confidence to collapsing into tears about how unpleasant the world is towards them.
Yes, the chameleon-esque
Mm.
mentality and lifestyle.
Yeah.
To me, it's fascinating from afar, not to be friends with someone, but even clinical presentations of individuals who commit crimes in one aspect of their life, but then present so differently when hospitalized. I mean, it's just such an interesting dynamic.
I mean, with Ted Bundy,
Yes.
the people who were at law school with him were tremendously shocked. They said he was the most
Mhm.
charming of people. And of course, his practice was the deliberate stranger. He would only prey upon people he'd never met before.
Mhm.
And it is something to watch. That we must. It's so easy to sort of put aside people's bad behavior. I am very much of the idea that we should absolutely forgive, and we should never forget. That if somebody
Mm.
has done something peculiar, then by all means forgive them for what they've done,
Yes.
if they show some contrition for what they've done. But the next time they do it, the first time, shame on you. The second time, shame on me. We do need to be
Yes.
and determine how reliable people are. If somebody has lied to you once, if somebody has made a promise that they broke once, by all means forgive them. The
Mhm.
second time they do it, be suspicious.
I couldn't agree more. And I think some people don't like that philosophy, but I think that it's a form of protecting yourself. And it's not necessarily holding on to animosity, which can make you sick. It's just remembering for your own protection. So I fully support that.
Yeah.
I must ask you if you are comfortable sharing, how did your process unfold of seeing the proverbial light, seeing clarity, or starting to disengage from Scientology?
It, it was really very straightforward. Uh,
Oh.
a guy who was traveling the world had gone and seen a lawyer who had 25 cases against Scientology. And we were all of us now exploring, because in Scientology, we were not meant to talk about anything that was going wrong. It was, I
Mm.
mean, somebody has just challenged me. I gave a talk at Eton College a few weeks ago, which was incredible. And we
Mm.
put the talk up, and somebody has said, well, how can John not have known about the intelligence agency functioning inside Scientology? And my response is, how many American citizens know what the CIA is doing? Just because you
Mhm.
belong to a particular group doesn't mean and it was very much an intelligence agency. So
Mm.
my friend visited Michael Flynn in Boston, and he came back with a stack of documents. And he said to me, oh, I'm never going to read these. So you have them. And these documents were collected by a journalist called Michael Lynn Shannon,
Hmm.
who is otherwise unknown to history because he never published. He very sensibly got out of the way. I don't believe that's his real name. I tried to find him for
Oh,
several years
interesting.
because
Okay.
he realized what Scientology would do. And they
Mm.
do. They harassed me for 16 years solid on a daily basis. Uh,
Oh,
it continues to some extent. There are still websites with ridiculous nonsense
I
about.
did see one, and
Yes.
just reading through it, I could tell. I mean, anyone outsider looking in, it seemed completely nonsensical. But that's besides the point. Not to derail you, but it was ridiculous.
The documents were, for example, his university records, which showed he claimed that he was a nuclear physicist, and his university records showed that he had failed atomic and molecular physics before being
Huh.
thrown out of university
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
scholarship. Many years later, I found a tape recorded lecture by Hubbard where he admitted that he had failed this course, which of course, it's not actually a nuclear physics course. Atomic and molecular physics, to split hairs perhaps, is not the same subject. You're not dealing with the same principles at all.
Mhm.
But from there, I made a very deep dive. I have something like 100, no, probably about 60 bankers boxes full of material about Hubbard's
Wow.
life and about Scientology,
Mhm.
which I very happily put into a university collection somewhere, because I stopped working on Scientology or investigating it
Did you? Yeah.
in a serious way back in 1996. I still
Mhm.
interview former members. It was very interesting when the guy who was running harassment for 20 years, Mike Rinder, came out, and I was able to actually interview him. And
Oh, wow. Yeah.
we'd only met once, and he'd come over here. I live in Nottingham in England, and he and a whole group of these top people from Scientology flew in to have this meeting with me and my lawyer. And I walked out of the meeting after about 10 minutes because they wouldn't say who they were. You know, they were there to intimidate me. My lawyer wanted them to give me money, and I'd already rejected the idea of my silence being, you know, a quantity that could be bought. So
Yes. Good for you.
I left the meeting, and here I am still talking. But Mike said that in that meeting, he said, "Oh, you seem like a perfectly nice guy. You know, you seem like
Mhm.
very reasonable. But I would have destroyed you if I could, because you're
Mm.
opposing Scientology, and Scientology was the only hope for humanity." He's since gone on to, you know, run Aftermath, the wonderful TV show with Leah
Mm.
Remini, and they still
Yes.
their game podcast. But
Mhm.
and Mike's one of those very interesting characters who is undoubtedly an empath. He is somebody who's really positive. And this was one of
Mhm.
the things that I wandered into, that you can take empaths and you can weaponize them. You
Yes.
can sell them on
Yes.
the idea of saving the world and then get them to do deplorable things. Um,
Absolutely. So it sounds like you started to recognize that not all of these pieces were adding up and seeing that there were some lies.
it was instantaneous for me
Mm.
because Hubbard claimed, he said, honesty is sanity. He talked about Scientology being the road to truth, and he said the road to truth must be trod with true steps. So as soon as I realized that he was a liar, I knew that there was something wrong with Scientology. It
Yes.
took 2 or 3 months after that for me to, you know, pull my head out of the thinking. I'd been involved for 9 years, and probably
Wow.
some years to get all of it out. But I made a very
Mhm.
determined decision, which many people don't, which was to
Mhm.
reject everything in Scientology and then think about it piecemeal, think about the ideas and see if I still accepted them.
Mhm.
And 38 years later, I don't accept any of them. There is nothing that wasn't stolen from somewhere else. And when it was
Mhm.
stolen, it was changed in some way to fit in with Hubbard's way of thinking. And I think it is typical of such people that you know, in researching stories he'd told about his life, he talked about wrestling with a bear. And there are different versions of this story. He couldn't tell the story the same way twice. And the pathological lying,
Yes.
it's quite typical of such people.
Mhm.
And I found, for me, the clincher was finding places where he'd completely contradicted himself. And what interested me most of all was that when I took that, because I was still very much connected with the ex-Scientology community, and most of the people I knew were still practicing Scientology,
Mhm.
I'd go to them and say, well, look, he says here that he was crippled and blinded at the end of World War II. And yet he says here that he was down in Hollywood the 2 weeks before the war ended, 3 weeks before the war, and he beat up 3 petty officers, so crippled and blinded. And
Oh.
with one woman, she looked at me and she said, well, the answer to that's obvious. And I said, really? She said, well, he obviously had 2 bodies.
Oh gosh. So now we're getting into not shape shifting, but just being in two places at two different times.
2 bodies. And when
Mhm.
I challenged her and said, but you know, he claimed to be a war hero, and yet he actually saw no service in World War II. It's not true. He
Mhm.
saw service, but he didn't see combat at any point in World War II. And she said, yes, he did. And I said, well, how do you know that? She said, I served with him. And it's like
Oh
my last
my.
lifetime. So people will build any justification because they have invested all of their hope into this. And that is
Yes.
my experience, that all of their desperation or all of their hope is invested, which is probably why the suicide rate in Scientology is significantly higher than in the world around, because when people's hope is taken from them, they collapse.
Absolutely. Yes. And as you had mentioned, I mean, the person's identity becomes so intertwined. And I also have noticed that there are some seemingly, whether it's the love bombing in the beginning or the wonderful welcome that people have into a high control group, or some bits of knowledge that do feel good, there are maybe some tiny good pieces. And part of me wonders if that even can prolong or help keep the claws of the group in the member, because they're holding on to hope for that good feeling. Have you noticed that, or what are your thoughts on that process?
I think the process is very much like an intimate relationship, that you have a honeymoon period. You have a
Yes.
period of infatuation. And,
Hmm.
you know, I work with the brilliant scholar Yuval Laor, who has looked at the evolutionary nature of fervor and awe in people. I think it's
Mm.
been the missing piece in our field. And in looking at his work, I said, well, look, you're talking about familial relationships. You know, the head of the cult is like a parent. You are like a child. The other members are like siblings, adopted siblings. And he's got into the teenager to parent relationship, which is quite interesting.
Hmm.
But I said, but you haven't got the romantic relationship. You haven't got the infatuation. And, you know, this was 6 years ago or something. And he has now done a great deal of work on limerence, as some people call it. I still like the word infatuation because of its
Yes.
derivation. It comes from fatuous, meaning silly.
Mm.
So that in that honeymoon period, you won't hear anything wrong about the new partner. You only see what's good about them.
Hmm.
Later on, you know, what was seen to be spontaneous is seen to be impetuous. You know,
Mm.
the same behaviors now have become negative. And people in authoritarian groups will attach in, that's how we attach. We fall in love. And
Yes.
then you have the, you know, the unwillingness to see what's wrong. And you also have the thing, again, in a personal relationship, where you look back to the glow, you look back to how good you felt, and you go, let's find our way back to that. And of course,
Exactly.
when you're dealing with a predator, of course, they're apologizing to you and saying they won't do it again. And, you
Hmm.
know, we want to believe that. Also, when we're attached to an individual or a group, it's scary to go out on your own. It's
Hmm.
scary to leave that. And
Most definitely. Hmm.
then, of course, you get the divorce, and the you know, one of the problems that can occur with former members is that they become too negative.
Mm.
And sadly, that's been picked up by people like Gordon Melton and before him, Brian Wilson, the sociologist, both of whom were paid by Scientology. There's no
Wow.
doubt of that. And they put forward this argument, you can't trust anything that a former member says, which is rather like saying, you know, if you left the Nazi party, then nothing you say about it will be accurate. It's
Hmm.
also denying a fundamental human right of expression and of observation. And I would say, as a former member, that my
Hmm.
work can be checked. You know,
Yes.
there are nearly 1,200 footnotes in my book about Scientology, and anybody can go and
Mhm.
check them. But there will also be people who are deeply upset. And instead of looking at the leader of the group and the teachings of the group, they will attack the members of the group.
Yes.
So
Yes.
a friend of mine was in what's called the Rehabilitation Project Force, this dreadful labor gulag that functions within Scientology. And
Mm.
so he was being humiliated, he was being abused, and some protesters walked past with their banners, and one of them spat at him. And that is the sort of thing that it's just so toxic, that with
Mm.
former members can provide so much help to the people who are
Yes.
still currently involved, but instead they see them as the enemy. And they're not. They're people who've been tricked and lied to in the same way that they were.
Most definitely. And that's why I have such a soft place in my heart for really the survivors of these cultic groups and even survivors of domestic violence relationships,
Cool.
because people are so quick to judge and say, oh, that would never happen to me. And like you said, they're unintelligent or they're weak, but that's not the case. I mean, many people are so highly educated and have had their own experiences in the world. And just to go back to what you were saying with the infatuation piece, because you
Yeah.
bring up so many good points, I even think about the release of dopamine and just the positive flow that physiologically goes through our bodies when we fall in love, when we have a great conversation or feel seen and heard. And these predators, as you know, are expert at letting somebody feel seen and heard, and as if they understand them.
Mm. And if you flatter somebody, you'll likely get an oxytocin response in them. You'll quite possibly get a serotonin response in them.
Hmm. Hmm.
Endorphin levels may rise up. And it's important for us. I think it's an aspect of maturity to grow up to the point where you can sit back from a conversation and think about what it is the other person wants from you,
Yes.
how they're going about it. And obviously, you and I, because we deal with this, we notice it more.
Yes.
If somebody is trying to manipulate us in some way.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but it amazes me that nothing is taught about this in our schools.
Right. Right. No safeguards, no classes,
Mm.
even classes on creating healthy boundaries and emotionally protecting yourself. They aren't even taught. And so I think that would be an excellent addition.
I think we have rather more in the UK than you do in the US, in that we do have
Hmm.
material on bullying, and we have what's called personal social health and economic education, which has
Hmm.
replaced religious education in the curriculum here. And I,
Hmm.
for the last few months, have been working on some materials for such courses because I
Hmm.
really believe that it is possible in a single generation to change attitudes, because this is information that's been withheld and it's not complicated.
Right.
Understanding, as I say, if somebody approaches you and they're really friendly towards you, they're
Hmm.
probably trying to sell you something.
Yes.
You should be,
Yes.
you don't need to be nasty to them, but you should be cautious.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I agree. I think it's always just assessing situations and assessing for a potential motive. And even from the provider side of things, I can see how physicians or people in positions of power over somebody's medical life, I mean, even that must be, I believe, really eyed carefully, because any sense of power can be taken advantage of.
yeah, I think that's really true, and really important that, um, and especially, I mean, at the moment in our National Health Service, we have the situation where mindfulness has
Mm,
been adopted and is prescribed. So if
mhm,
you're suffering
mhm,
from depression or anxiety, a doctor, and it's a psychiatrist friend who told me about this, you can be disciplined as a doctor for not recommending mindfulness. However, there is not one shred of scientifically verifiable proof that mindfulness will help with anxiety or depression. The only paper I'm aware of that is about social anxiety, and there's something
mm,
there. And the problem is that so much is being, there's the authority. So I went with a friend to a pain clinic here, and the woman advising, the medical professional advising, said, "Have you tried mindfulness?" And my friend
mhm,
said,
mhm,
"No." And I said, "What do you know about mindfulness?" And the medical professional said, "I've got some CDs. I don't know anything about it." So you get this situation where, because it's recommended by an authority, and
mhm,
even if we dig off into, about 30 years ago, the Royal College of Psychiatry here did an assessment of the use of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like
mhm.
Prozac. And they said that general practitioners, doctors here, 80% of their prescriptions were erroneous. because only 20% of them were going to people who have endogenous depression, as opposed to people who are presenting as not being happy or having reactive depression. And so even people in authority with 8 years of training will just, well, this is what the drug companies say, so we'll do this, without really understanding. I mean, I've seen Prozac prescribed for anxiety, where it's specifically, Eli Lilly have said in their research, it can actually cause anxiety.
Yes. Well, yes.
So you have to have somebody who understands the subject and the substance and can diagnose properly, rather than somebody who's just handing out a pill and somebody's believing that it should, their authority is enough.
Yes, yes. And I encourage everyone to always ask questions. But yeah, SSRIs are very commonly used to treat anxiety, depression. Although different SSRIs can sometimes work differently and better for anxiety. And also, I mean, even mindfulness, if used correctly and grounding and being in the present moment, these things can help better manage anxiety and depression if used correctly. But
Yeah,
I think, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, please.
Our problem is defining mindfulness in the first place. I'm essentially talking about the meditative practice. Grounding is, of course, as you say, a very useful practice, but it doesn't belong to mindfulness. Mindfulness adopted it. The group of people who, Jon Kabat-Zinn and the people who introduced these methods, and through Thai Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, it is very specifically seated meditation that they are giving as a prescription, alongside mindfulness coloring books and things like this. And while calming down, yes, say grounding yourself, seeing where you are, stopping the rush of thoughts, those are very good things. But on the other hand, there is a lot of study of meditation that shows that it can cause psychotic breaks. It can cause relaxation-induced anxiety. And having been around that world, I studied Zazen in a Zen monastery at the age of 18 before getting into Scientology. I practiced for a year. And I found it useful. So I'm not at all opposed to the practice of meditation, but I would absolutely recommend Willoughby Britton's website. She's at Brown University, and she's a mindfulness meditator. But she chose, for example, she started by doing a study of sleep, believing that mindfulness practitioners would sleep better than other people. She found the opposite was true, that the control group actually had more deep sleep and woke less often than mindfulness meditators. But she puts forward some very good pointers, still believing in the practice, but some very good pointers about what to do about it. And I think the underlying thing is we don't have to believe what we're told.
You hit the nail on the head.
Back.
And in addition, one size does not fit all. And that is the biggest issue that I have with high control groups is there is the expectation that their doctrine is the word. No one is to go against it. And so almost similar to whereas meditation may be helpful for you and I, it may not be helpful for someone else. And we are allowed to pick and choose. But with the high control groups, the power of choice is very much lacking or completely absent.
It's also fair to say, yes, exactly, the cookie cutter method. It's also fair to say that one of the reasons that people become involved in groups is because they will offer a technique that leads to a peak experience. It leads to a euphoria or a sense of being high. When I came away from Scientology, you see, I already knew when I went in and we were told to sit and stare at each other, I knew that you would start hallucinating because I'd done a year's meditation before that. And I knew that the room would bend and things would change. What I didn't know was that these were typical aspects of altered states of being or trance states. And you feel euphoric, you feel great.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
chanting, singing, jumping up and down, dancing. There are all sorts of methods. The Rajneeshis, had quite a few of these things. And those things will make you feel exhilarated.
Absolutely.
Exhilarated doesn't necessarily mean that you've improved in any way. And people, I think, become addicted to the techniques, and they just as with drug users, that generally when somebody first uses a drug, that's the highest they'll get with that drug. And after that, they're trying to get that experience back. And so you have sort of cult junkies, people who, because whenever they go to the Kingdom Hall service, they feel all right again. And again, it's desperation that's being treated. It's keeping yourself cut off from the world because the world might be painful. And it's generally better to open up to the world. It's generally better to, and one of the things that really bothers me is when people won't talk about something because it might threaten the beliefs they have. Now, if the beliefs they have are true, they've got nothing to worry about in talking about.
And it almost seems like that can even, that the secrecy that must be maintained, whether on that small scale of being in a relationship with somebody who's abusive, or as we're talking about in these large groups, to me, the secrecy is always a red flag. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. That as I started to hear stories about Ron Hubbard during the last few weeks that I believed, I suddenly had access to people, and you were never meant to say anything bad. Now, I'd not been near him. I'd not worked in the organization. I had no idea that people were living for months on a diet of rice and beans and nothing else. No idea that they were working 90-hour week. They weren't seeing their children. Nobody would say these things. It was all, we're all smiling, we're all happy. Suddenly I had access to people who were no longer under those constraints. And I realized, there's a particular guy that I talked with who'd worked on Hubbard made these little films, all of which have been withdrawn, curiously. They were pretty awful, but he put together a huge crew and made these films. And he was so incredibly abusive. This is in about 1977, 78. He was so abusive to all of the people around him. And my idea of the ideal human being is somebody who has equanimity.
Yes.
That they don't lose their temper, that they don't feel they have to dominate and punish other people. And so I found that I've been following a raging maniac all of these years, and it had been concealed from me because people want you to see the best. We have the same thing with the awful abuse of children in the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church, the Jehovah's Witnesses. It's covered up.
Yes.
The Jehovah's Witnesses talk about having 23,000 known abusers, and they will not release the names to the authorities because of some religious confidentiality that they that exists. And they, of course, they lost a case here where they were charged as having given the charge of children to an individual who was a known abuser, a convicted abuser. We also find that they actually recruited in prisons, and these people would be forgiven for what they'd done, and then they would marry a widow who had children, or so. But that cover up, that sense of, my church or my community is more important than the truth.
Yes.
What might happen again? What happened to my identity if it proves that I'm part of a group that isn't really benign, that isn't really positive?
It's hard to separate. That's what I've seen. And even some of the materials that I release in studying certain groups, the vitriol that is spewed at people who go against someone's group can be just intense, for lack of a better word. And I think so. I also think that can go into why people continue to stay silent or don't speak out, because even as you mentioned, the harassment that you received for years, it's a nightmarish situation.
And members of science. I was talking with a guy called Skip Press, who's an ex-Scientologist, and he was thanking me because he'd read my book and that had caused him to leave Scientology. And then he said that when he'd told Scientology he'd read my book, they'd sent some people around and they'd said, well, John Atack used to be a heroin addict. And I went, what? What are you talking about? I've never taken heroin in my life. I've never physically seen heroin, and been in the same room with it. But he sort of brushed me aside and said, well, whatever. It's like, no, hang on. They've accused me of attempted murder. They've accused me of rape. They've accused me of molesting a child. These are typical things which will then be believed by the followers. And you're sort of saying, and so why was I never convicted of any of these things? Why was I never charged or taken to court if you have evidence of these things? Why was I allowed to bring up my 4 children if true? But this kind of black and white thinking, this, everything becomes binary, everything becomes wrong or right, rather than understanding all of those gradations of truth that exist. And people become oppositional, they become emotional and overwhelmed, and there is no way that reasoning can survive those strong emotions. There's no way that we can be, we have to be dispassionate to be rational.
Yes, absolutely. And it also, just from you mentioning your experience, which thank you for sharing, where people accused you of so many different things.
They still do.
Yes. Well, it just goes to show that there's such the high discouragement of any kind of critical thinking, or, like you said, the rational thought of current members. It's just the strong adherence. What we say is truth. And so would you also say that that is a red flag, even if it's a workplace environment? Would you say that's a red flag as well?
Yes, I think the insistence that one has the truth, and we need to be skeptical.
Yes.
I did a series of interviews with a Scientologist called Andy Nolch, and in Australia, and he interviewed me. He wanted to interview me for his channel there, and I didn't research him, and I should have done. But even if I had done, I'd probably have had the conversations, because I'm a very gregarious human being. And when I didn't post, he posted the interviews on his channel, but I didn't post them because I found out that he had been in prison for basically drawing a giant phallus prior to a memorial for a woman who'd been murdered. Which was, he's anti-feminist, and so he's into all sorts of bizarre conspiracy theories.
Yes.
But nonetheless, I did the interviews, and then I decided not to post them. And because I hadn't posted them, he did a video attacking me.
Oh, wow.
John Atack Debunked. And it was a wonderful opportunity to look at what he was saying. And so my favorite video of the 300 or so on my channel is going through these things line by line and saying, okay, well, let's look at that. Can't trust John Atack because he doesn't like Donald Trump. Donald Trump's awesome. You can't trust John Atack because he doesn't like Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin's awesome. And so on and so on. So looking at things again, well, okay, let's not get into throwing brickbats and saying, calling Andy Nolch names for doing this. Let's take the points he makes and reason our way through them and see what the evidence supports. And to get to that point of view is what's called being grown up.
Yes.
And we see far too much. And again, among our politicians, it's a charade, looking at Congress or looking at our parliament and seeing how childishly our leaders behave. And the narcissistic behavior that we so often see. It would be so nice to live in a world of adults,
Yes. And I am very grateful. I know I've said this, but I am grateful that you're so willing to share your experiences, because it's something that's so relatable. I mean, how many times do we get an invitation to, whether it's a meeting, or even just recently, I had an email where someone was wanting to interview me on their TV channel. And I did some research and found that they're promoting a very strange form of therapy that has no peer reviewed research. And it's a matter of, I don't want to promote that. I don't want to be affiliated with that. But it happens all the time, John, to so many of us. We get, whether it's an email or at church or a community group. And so I'm grateful that you shared that, just as even that to me is good feedback for folks to think about who's asking you to do this and what are they about? What are they involved in?
Question the source of information,
Yes.
and what the benefits are to the person giving you that information.
Yes.
Yeah. And it crosses, there are so many subject areas here: human trafficking, pedophile grooming,
Yes.
the multi-level marketing, that
Oh,
somebody
yes.
wants to show you the plan and get you involved with Amway or something.
That's
That
right.
all of these structures, all of the get rich quick schemes, all of the, I'm a Nigerian prince and I just need a few dollars to be able to free up millions and I'll share them with you, or the young woman who's approaching you and suddenly needs airfare from we live in a world of scams, and we live
We
in
do.
a world, and thankfully it is just a fairly small proportion of people, probably less than 5% of people, who are intent upon scamming us. But it has, of course, all moved onto the internet now, even cult recruitment, with people like dreadful Stefan Molyneux, for example. I have a particular problem with Jordan Peterson, because I don't think he knows what he's talking about. I haven't got a lobster in my head. It's pretty simple. But he's created this huge cultish following where people dote upon him as if he, was the wisest person alive. So, and then he's an insignificant example in terms he's not pushing people into
harmful.
But some of the beliefs espousing, which are right wing and anti-liberal, are certainly dangerous. So, and we do need to be very careful. It's very easy to sign up for things that will go against our better interests.
It absolutely is. And I think that even when we receive invitations from, I think about a close family member of mine who is very skeptical, but they received an invitation to have a meeting about a great product. Thankfully, this person said, this is a cult. I mean, they were able to just see right through it, but they knew the person. And so there was that familiarity, which is a form of affinity fraud in and of itself. Well, John, I could continue to speak with you probably for hours. I'm sure most people have that experience with you. It's just so much knowledge, so easy to talk to, flattering you, but I do mean it. I'm very genuine.
Oh, it's not flattery then, it's praise.
Yes. Okay. Yes, that is praise then.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Do you have any final words or words of wisdom that you would like to impart on listeners or viewers? And then, of course, I want to be able to know I know where to get it, but where can others get your book, Opening Our Minds?
My books are available through any bookstore. They're available on Amazon as ebooks. Opening Our Minds is also available as an audiobook on Audible. And I think it is, basically the simple piece of advice to people is think twice. If something sounds too good to be true, it will be.
Yes.
There is no such thing as a free lunch, or in Scientology, a free personality test. So if something seems seductive and wonderful, separate yourself from that environment, even if it just means you're going to the bathroom. Take yourself away from the environment and think about it. Preferably get your cell phone and talk to a friend about it before doing it. Use a search engine and look the person up, check things, just get into the habit of checking things out. It's not rude. You know, you don't have to be unpleasant to the person. They don't even have to know that you're checking them out.
That's right.
But be skeptical in the world. And when if you find out that the product is wonderful, that the religion is true, that the psychotherapy does work, then that's fine. You won't have done any harm by taking your time about it. So think twice.
I think that's beautiful. I think that is great advice that's so relatable, that can be applied to a range of different experiences in life. So thank you, Jon. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll look forward to staying in touch.
Great. It's been wonderful meeting you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you.
Cheers, bye.
Hi, Jon here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.